Well, friends, hello, Andy C. Luter here, your Bible webinar coach, and I want to come to you with another one of my mini Bible webinars. Not too terribly long ago, I recorded a webinar that discussed the first king of Israel, and that would have been King Saul. Now, I intentionally restricted my lesson on King Saul to the early part of his career, his introduction to Samuel, his acknowledgement, affirmation, and anointing by Samuel. I also talked about his visit to the outpost Philistine city, him being overcome by God and prophesying. Well, friends, I want to take you just a little bit further today. And toward that end, I want to welcome you to this Bible webinar, this mini Bible webinar on King Saul Continued. This is actually an extension of my earlier webinar on the first king of Israel. And of course, that would have been King Saul. Now, the remainder of King Saul's life, and I concentrated last time on chapter 10, but I'd like to look at chapters 11 through 15, because the remainder of Saul's life as a king takes place between these chapters of 11 through 15. In addition to Saul, the Bible continues to include Samuel the prophet in the narrative. Now here, I want to take just a quick moment to explain why I am specifically using the title prophet. Prior to this, Samuel is the last of the judges. He is in charge. He has authority. He is a leader of the people. Now, in this role and capacity as prophet, he is no longer the ultimate or supreme leader of the children of Israel. He is now an advisor to the king. And to help distinguish and differentiate between his role as advisor and mouthpiece of God, I will be referring to him in this lesson as Samuel the prophet, as opposed to Samuel the judge. In my earlier lesson, I talked about the difficult time that Samuel must have had, having gone from being the ultimate leader of the people to a secondary role of being an advisor to the king. Of course, God reminds him that his rejection is not a rejection of him per se, but is rather a rejection of God. Now, having said that and keeping that in mind, we concluded last time with Samuel announcing that Saul is to be king. That Saul is to be king. However, there are certain men who oppose Saul from being king. Now, in my last lesson, I didn't talk about this a whole lot, but I did include a mentioning that when Saul was announced as king, everybody was not in favor of his kingship. There were actually those who resisted, those who opposed him being king. And as a result of that, Saul at that particular time did not assume the role of king. You remember that he was out chasing donkeys for his father. And after this opposition and even his announcement as king, he goes back to doing that which he was doing prior to having been named king. Now, the contemporary application and lesson here, friends, is that sometimes opposition can result in you being denied the very blessing that has been assigned to your hands. And oftentimes we go back to doing that which we were doing before God spoke to our hearts and before God gave us his assignment. What I hope to demonstrate in this lesson is that Saul not only has opportunity to prove his leadership, but even those who initially opposed him had to rethink their position as it related to Saul. So we pick up here in chapter 11 with an individual by the name of Nahash. He is the king of the Ammonites. And if you look closely at the screen, then Nahash the Ammonite came up and encamped against Jabesh Gibeah. And all the men of Jabesh said unto Nahash, make a covenant with us, and we will serve you. Jabesh Gilead was an Israelite city on the east side of the river of Jordan. Now, I'm going to stop reading there. And let me just kind of expand upon this ever so quickly, because it is relative to Saul eventually become the recognized and identified king of all of Israel. It seems that the Ammonites, led by their king, Nahash, attacks one of the tribes of Israel, the tribe and the city of Jabesh Gibeah. Now, the men of Jabesh Gibeah have no stomach to fight, and they actually offer to surrender to this king that is attacking them. However, the king imposes this proposition and this criteria where he says, I will only sign a treaty and not disrupt your peace if each of you will gouge out your right eye, the rather high price to pay for peace. Now, the men of Jabesh Gibeah say, by this time tomorrow, if none of our kinsmen come to our rescue, then we will surrender to you. And word goes out that Jabesh Gibeah is in trouble. And when Saul, who has returned to his father's home at Kish, hears of what has happened, he rallies the individuals who belong to Israel. He actually cuts oxen in pieces, sends it to all of the tribes, and says to them, this is what will happen to you if you do not support me in my support of the men of Jabesh Gibeah. And so Saul rallies Israel to come to the rescue of the men of Jabesh from Nahash, the Ammonite. Now, here is what we learn from that story, and that is that Saul is successful in assembling, rallying the men of Israel, some 30,000 plus 600 men from Judah, all assemble on the side of Saul. He faces the Ammonites, he defeats them, and on the heels of his defeat, Samuel the prophet reassembles Israel at Mizpah and reacknowledges, reconfirms Saul as the king. Now, here's the interesting thing, and that is when they reassemble, the people who assemble now want to know, where are those men who opposed Saul from being king in the first place? And they actually promise or even threaten to take those men's life, to actually put them to death. However, Saul takes the higher ground and says, no, because on this day God has given us the victory, and he refuses to allow the men who had opposed him to be harmed by his now followers and supporters. So as a result of the victory, the people want to kill those who had opposed Saul. However, Saul refuses to harm those who had spoke against him. He is so elated that God has given him the victory. He wants no bloodshed on the part of the children of Israel. Now, this is important because it actually is the event that makes Saul the king of what we call the united monarchy. All 12 tribes, Reuben, Simon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, and Joseph, or the twin tribes of Manasseh and Ephraim, all confederate themselves under the leadership of Saul, and Saul becomes the first king of the united monarchy. Now, Samuel warns the people about rising up against Saul, who is God's anointed. Now remember, I said that he reassembles, Samuel the prophet, reassembles the people at Mizpah, and he recites the history of God with them. He says, you were in Egypt, you were slaves, God delivered you from the hand of Pharaoh. You spent 40 years in the wilderness, but God did not leave you even while you were in the wilderness. You came to Canaan. God subdued the hostile tribes in Canaan so that you could occupy the land. And yet in the face of all of that, you still insisted on having a king. Now, Saul is the king that you have requested. You asked God for a king. God has replied by giving you Saul. Therefore, as long as you obey his words and obey his command, God will bless you. But you will suffer consequences if you rise up against Saul. Why? Because Saul is the anointed of God. Saul is reaffirmed as king of all Israel. Now, I want to pause here because a little later on, you will remember that Saul chases David. He initially is enamored with David, but when David is so successful as a soldier, Saul rises up against him, tries to kill him, and then David has an opportunity to kill Saul in the cave of Adullam. However, he refuses to do so, and I want to suggest to you that one of the reasons that David did not take up arms against Saul, did not take advantage of the advantage that he had against Saul, he literally had the drop on Saul, is because of these words, this speech that was delivered by Samuel so many years earlier, where he warns the people, and obviously David was in receipt of this information, not to raise a hand against Saul. Why? Because Saul is the anointed of God. Actually, during the lifetime of David, that is the explanation that he gives, that the reason he will not war against Saul is because despite everything that Saul had done, even his attempt to personally injure him, David, he was still the anointed of God and was still under the hand of God's protection. Now, some time later, Saul performs a sacrifice, fearful that he has lost the favor of God and the support of his men. Saul offers a sacrifice to God as he prepares to do battle against the Philistines. Now, friends, this is the reason that is most given for why Saul lost his kingdom. As he prepared to fight against the Philistines, it was common to be under the protection and the cover of God. Now, Samuel had promised to show up on a certain day at a certain time to render a sacrifice to God so that Saul, as the commander of the army, would have the covering, the protection, and the favor of God. Now, when Samuel does not show up on the day and at the time that he had announced that he would do so, Saul takes matters in his own hands. He's watching his men flee and scatter, and he performs the sacrifice. Now, the sacrifice was only to be performed by the priest. Saul was a king. He did not occupy the office of a priest. Therefore, he was not eligible or entitled to perform a sacrifice. And as he is finishing the sacrifice, Samuel shows up. He asks Saul what he has done. Saul explains that he was fearful of losing the support of his men, and so he performed the sacrifice. And that's when Samuel mentions these words that you have heard so many times: obedience is better than sacrifice. To be obedient to the command of God and allow the sacrifice to be performed only by the priest, that is better than the sacrifice, than doing the sacrifice. And this is a reprimand on the part of Samuel against Saul. Now, typically we think of that as being the reason that Saul did not eventuate, or his family did not retain the throne of Israel. But if you would just walk with me just a little bit further, you'll see that that is not all of the case. We do know that Samuel does rebuke Saul for getting out of his lane and doing that which he really had no right to do. Here is what is interesting, though. Saul is 30 when he becomes king, and he rules for a period of 42 years. And so even though Samuel, at the point of Saul having performed the sacrifice, he says to Saul that you will now forfeit, your family will now forfeit. God had intended for you to be king, and that included even his line to be king over Israel forever. But because you have done this, you have lost that right. However, Saul continues to reign for a period of 42 years. He's 30 when he becomes king, and he does not exit the stage until he is 72 years old. So here is the reason that Saul actually loses his kingdom. Much later on in life, Saul takes battle against the Amalekites and a king by the name of Agag, and he is told to totally destroy the Amalekites and their king. However, Saul spares Agag and keeps the best cattle for himself. Now, the significance of this, friends, is that he was told to kill everybody, the cattle, the property, everything, to leave nothing standing. However, Saul takes the initiative to spare the life of the king that opposes him, and to keep the best bounty, the best of the herd, the best of the livestock for himself. Now, this kind of goes back to Hophni and Phinehas, who were the sons of Eli. And remember, Eli lost his favor because his sons, or he allowed his sons to take advantage of the offerings that were brought and were meant for God. And so this seemingly is a reoccurrence of this. And Saul here is being, again, disobedient. And remember, he had earlier been warned that obedience is better than sacrifice. Finally, Samuel takes matters in his own hands, and because God had decreed that everyone was to be killed, Samuel takes again matters into his own hand, and he kills Agag, who is the king of the Amalekites, and fulfills that which God had promised. And then what the Bible then here says is that Saul does not see Samuel again. This severs their relationship, and Saul does not see Samuel again. Now, in the very next few chapters, not only does Samuel exit the life of Saul, but in the next chapter, he goes to the house of Jesse, and there he anoints a little shepherd boy by the name of David, and that David would eventually become the replacement to Saul. Now, this is not an exhaustive treatment on Saul's life, but I do hope and pray that you've gotten a better understanding of not only who Saul was, but the remainder of his career as king. Well, friends, that takes up just about all of my time, and I certainly want to thank you for yours. I am Bishop Andy C. Luter, your this has been a mini Bible webinar as I continue my discussion on the first king of Israel. I do hope that you would take time to take a look at our online courses. I have a number of online courses, 60 courses that I've put together, much like what you've been watching for these last several minutes. There is so much to be gleaned from the material and the research that we have put together, especially for you. There is a link on the bottom of the screen. I do hope that you'll take advantage of it. And if nothing more, just take a look at what we have. Even if you don't make a decision to enroll in one of the courses, I think that you'll be fascinated by some of the material, actually all of the material that we have worked very, very hard to make available to you. So again, I am Bishop Andy C. Luter. This has been a mini Bible webinar, a continuation of an earlier Bible webinar on King Saul, the first king of Israel. Until next time, do remember, God loves you, I love you, and we look forward to seeing you real soon. God bless, my friends.